Verifiable Codex. Ancient discoveries, modern revelations.
You know that feeling when you're cleaning out an old attic and suddenly find something that makes your heart skip a beat. Maybe it's a letter from your grandfather you never knew existed, or a photograph that changes everything you thought you knew about your family's history. Well, imagine that moment multiplied by 3,000 years, because that's exactly what happened when a team of archaeologists working in the dusty hills of Israel made a discovery so extraordinary, it's rewriting biblical history books. They thought they were just doing routine survey work at Tel Shiloh, another ancient site in a country where every shovel full of dirt might contain treasures from antiquity. The morning started like any other, with careful grid mapping and systematic soil removal. But when their brushes revealed the corner of what appeared to be a massive stone wall, everything changed. Your breath would catch in your throat if you had been there watching them uncover layer after layer of perfectly preserved stonework, realizing they weren't looking at just another ancient building, but at something that had been waiting 3 millennia to tell its story. What they discovered beneath that protective blanket of earth wasn't just archaeological treasure. It was a fortress palace with defensive walls thick enough to withstand siege warfare, with hidden chambers and secret passages, with storage areas for provisions and weapons, all designed for someone who needed to disappear from the most powerful army in the ancient world. Someone who needed sanctuary while the king of Israel hunted him like an animal through the wilderness. Someone whose very survival would determine the future of God's chosen people. Here's where this story becomes absolutely mind-blowing. Tucked inside stone crevices throughout the palace, archaeologists found fragments of papyrus covered with Paleo Hebrew script, ancient documents that read like a first-hand journal of one of the most dramatic periods in biblical history. These aren't just random historical artifacts. They're detailed accounts of how David, the shepherd boy who killed Goliath, survived his fugitive years while running from King Saul's murderous jealousy. Scientists tested this and discovered something incredible. The papyrus fragments date precisely to the 10th century BC, exactly when 1 Samuel tells us David was fleeing for his life through the mountains of Judea. But what makes these documents absolutely extraordinary isn't just their age, it's their content. Written in the archaic Hebrew script used during David's lifetime, they describe a fortified house in Shiloh where a chosen one gathered loyal followers who would risk everything to protect Israel's future king. Picture this moment when Dr. Lee Abrams, one of the world's leading experts in ancient Hebrew texts, first examined these papyrus fragments under laboratory lighting. Her hands were literally shaking as she read descriptions of events that perfectly match the biblical account of David's escape from Saul's court. These aren't just historical documents, she whispered to her colleagues. They're like reading David's personal diary. The Shiloh Papyri map his secret refuge with geographical precision that matches every detail we're uncovering at this site. You won't believe what they found next. As excavation continued, the palace revealed architectural features that correspond exactly with the papyri's descriptions. Underground storage chambers where the fragments mention hidden provisions. Guard towers positioned precisely where the ancient texts describe watchmen posted to warn of approaching danger. Secret escape tunnels that align perfectly with the papyri's accounts of how David's followers could vanish into the surrounding wilderness if discovery threatened. Consider this reality that should send chills down your spine. We're living in 2025, and suddenly we're holding physical proof of events that shaped the entire trajectory of human history. The timing isn't random or coincidental. Many biblical scholars believe we're entering a prophetic season when God is unveiling hidden truths that will strengthen faith for unprecedented challenges ahead. The discovery of David's palace perfectly aligns with Psalm 27:5, where David himself wrote, "For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me. He shall set me high upon a rock." Think about what this means for every believer in America Whether you worship in a small country church where your grandmother's favorite hymns still echo from memory, or in an urban congregation where contemporary praise shakes the building's foundations, David's journey from shepherd boy to fugitive to king speaks to something deeper than cultural differences or historical curiosity. It speaks to the universal human experience of trusting God when circumstances make no earthly sense. Here's the truth that changes everything about how we read David's story. Shiloh wasn't just a random hiding place chosen for convenience or safety. It was Israel's first religious center, the sacred site where Joshua set up the tabernacle after conquering the Promised Land, where the high priest ministered before the temple was built in Jerusalem, where God's presence dwelled most powerfully among his people. When David fled to Shiloh, he wasn't just seeking physical refuge. He was running straight to the place where heaven touched earth. The Hebrew word behind Shiloh reveals profound meaning that most people miss completely. Shiloh comes from Shelah, meaning peace, tranquility, or rest, but it carries deeper connotations of completion and fulfillment, suggesting a place where God's purposes find their ultimate expression. When Jacob prophesied in Genesis 49:10 that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, he was speaking not just about a place, but about a person who would bring ultimate peace and fulfillment to God's people. Picture David, exhausted and terrified after his narrow escape from Saul's palace, arriving at this sacred site where generations of Israelites had worshipped and sought God's guidance. The Shiloh Papyri describe his emotional state with raw honesty that will break your heart. One fragment records his prayer upon arrival: "My soul flees to you as a bird to its nest, as a deer to running water, for you alone are my refuge when the king's anger burns against me." The Shiloh Papyri chronicle David's fugitive years with details that bring these ancient events into sharp focus. One fragment describes how provisions were secretly delivered by sympathetic priests who risked Saul's wrath to aid the future king. Another mentions lookouts posted on surrounding hills to watch for royal soldiers. The Hebrew script uses specialized vocabulary that appears nowhere else in ancient literature, suggesting these accounts came from eyewitnesses who lived through these harrowing months alongside David. Imagine if your family had kept a detailed journal of their most difficult seasons, complete with names, dates, and emotional reflections, then hidden that journal where only your great-great-grandchildren would find it during their darkest hour. That's essentially what the Shiloh Papyri represent for the family of faith. Their first and testimony that God's protection isn't just theological theory, but historical reality preserved in ink and stone for exactly this generation to discover. You need to understand the revolutionary implications of what archaeologists found when they began systematic excavation of David's palace. The structure is massive, covering nearly 2 acres and requiring skilled craftsmen and enormous resources to construct. Defensive walls 3 feet thick and 20 feet high surround a central courtyard, capable of housing hundreds of people. Multiple levels connected by stone staircases suggest this wasn't temporary shelter, but a permanent base of operations, where David transformed from hunted fugitive into the leader of a movement that would reshape Israel's destiny. Dr. Miriam Stein, who directed the Tel Shiloh excavation, described her first walk through these ruins as stepping directly into biblical narrative. This palace was David's command center, she explained with obvious emotion. Every architectural feature speaks to someone who needed to hide, but also needed to lead. The throne room, the council chambers, the weapon storage areas, all perfectly designed for someone building a kingdom in exile. Here's what absolutely amazes me about the artifacts they discovered throughout the palace complex. Pottery fragments match the exact time period when 1 Samuel tells us David was gathering his followers in the wilderness. Bronze weapons bear markings consistent with military equipment from that era. Most remarkable, archaeologists found a seal ring bearing Paleo Hebrew inscriptions that reads David ben Yishai, which translates as David, son of Jesse, possibly belonging to the future king himself. Consider the courage it took for David to establish this stronghold so close to Saul's sphere of influence. He wasn't just hiding in caves or wandering through distant deserts. He was building an alternative government within 30 miles of Jerusalem, where Saul ruled from his palace. The location demonstrates either incredible faith or desperate audacity, probably both. David understood that God had anointed him as Israel's next king, and he was preparing to assume that responsibility even, while officially classified as an outlaw. Think about 1 Samuel 22:2, which tells us that everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, so he became captain over them. And there were about 400 men with him. The Shiloh Papyri describe exactly this transformation, how desperate men from every tribe of Israel found hope and purpose under David's leadership at this secret stronghold. The Hebrew word sar used for captain suggests not just military command, but the authority of someone destined for kingship. Picture this scene that the papyri describe in vivid detail. Men arriving at the palace compound after dangerous journeys through hostile territory, some fleeing creditors, others escaping Saul's oppressive policies, still others simply recognizing that God was doing something unprecedented through this young fugitive who had killed Israel's greatest enemy with a sling and 5 smooth stones. The Hebrew text captures their excitement at finding not just refuge, but destiny. You won't believe what the archaeological evidence reveals about daily life in David's palace during those fugitive years. Storage chambers contained remnants of grain jars and oil vessels, confirming the papyri's descriptions of how sympathetic supporters secretly supplied provisions to David's growing band of followers. One chamber held over 200 intact storage jars, suggesting the palace operated as a significant provisioning center for extended periods. Weapon caches hidden in underground vaults match the ancient documents, accounts of how David armed his supporters for the conflicts that lay ahead. Archaeologists discovered bronze spearheads, iron sword fragments, leather armor remnants, and hundreds of arrowheads, all dating to the correct period and showing signs of actual battle use. The papyri describe David's followers as mighty men of valor, and the physical evidence supports their reputation as formidable warriors. Here's the crazy part about what scientists discovered when they analyzed the palace's construction techniques. The stonework required engineering knowledge and construction skills far beyond what you'd expect from a hastily built hideout. Master craftsmen cut and fitted massive limestone blocks with precision that rivals any ancient construction project. The builders knew they were creating something historically significant, constructing the first palace of Israel's greatest king, even while he remained officially an outlaw. Consider this reality that should strengthen every believer facing impossible circumstances. The same divine protection that preserved David's palace through 3,000 years of conquest, destruction, war, and neglect has preserved these papyrus fragments to encourage our generation. The palace survived Assyrian invasions, Babylonian conquests, Persian rule, Greek occupation, Roman destruction, Islamic conquest, Crusader War, Ottoman administration, British mandates, and modern conflicts. Every empire that tried to erase Israel's history failed to destroy this testimony to God's faithfulness. The Hebrew word misgab appears repeatedly throughout the Shiloh Papyri, meaning a high secure place, a stronghold, a refuge that cannot be conquered. It's the same word David uses in Psalm 18:2 when he declares, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." The archaeological evidence proves that God provided exactly such a stronghold for David's preparation years. Think about the prophetic timing of these discoveries. We're living through a period when faith itself seems under siege, when biblical truth is questioned in academic institutions, when archaeological findings are often used to challenge rather than confirm scriptural accounts, when even church members sometimes wonder whether Scripture describes real events or merely inspiring stories. Into this environment of doubt and skepticism, God has provided tangible proof that His word accurately records historical reality, that His promises have always been backed by divine power. Imagine what it means for American Christianity, that these discoveries unite believers across every cultural divide. In historically black congregations where spirituals still echo with themes of divine deliverance from persecution, David's story resonates with deep understanding of trusting God through injustice and oppression. Songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and Wade in the Water carry the same themes of divine protection that sustained David at Shiloh. The palace discovery validates that same enduring hope that carried enslaved people through their darkest hours. In traditional white churches, where classic hymns celebrate God's faithfulness through generations, this archaeological validation confirms that same enduring protection sustained biblical heroes through their darkest hours. Hymns like "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" and "Rock of Ages" take on new meaning when you realize they're describing the same divine protection that provided David with an actual fortress of stone and mortar, where he could safely prepare for his destiny. Here's what changes everything about how we understand God's timing and purposes. The Shiloh Papyri don't just record David's survival during his fugitive years. They describe his transformation from a shepherd boy, running for his life, into a leader who could unite fractured tribes into a kingdom that would endure for centuries. The palace at Tel Shiloh wasn't just a hiding place. It was a training ground where God prepared His chosen king for responsibilities that would affect human history forever. You need to grasp the extraordinary nature of what archaeologists found in the palace's inner chambers. Royal seals, administrative documents, evidence of diplomatic correspondence with neighboring kingdoms, all suggesting that even during his official outlaw status, David was conducting the business of statecraft from this secret stronghold. The Shiloh Papyri describe meetings with tribal leaders who recognized David's divine anointing despite Saul's continued reign in Jerusalem. One particularly fascinating fragment describes David's administrative innovations during his time at Shiloh. The Hebrew text mentions scribes of the house who kept detailed records of his followers, their tribal affiliations, their skills, and their assigned responsibilities within his growing organization. This system would later become the foundation for the sophisticated bureaucracy that made David's kingdom so successful. Even exile, he was learning the art of governance. Consider the faith it took for these early supporters to risk everything by joining David at Shiloh. They had no guarantee that his cause would ultimately triumph. From earthly perspective, they were aligning themselves with a fugitive against the established king of Israel. Saul commanded the official army, controlled the treasury, possessed all the traditional symbols of royal authority. Yet something about David's character, his obvious divine favor, his vision for Israel's future, convinced them to abandon security for an uncertain adventure that would reshape their nation's destiny. Picture this moment when you realize the profound implications of these discoveries for your own life. David's palace at Shiloh represents more than ancient history or archaeological curiosity. It's a prophetic picture of how God uses seasons of apparent defeat and hiding to prepare His people for purposes greater than they can imagine. Just as David's wilderness years shaped him for kingship, God uses difficult seasons to develop character and faith that will sustain His people through future challenges. Think about Psalm 57, which David wrote while hiding in caves during his flight from Saul. "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for my soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge, until these calamities have passed by." The Shiloh Papyri suggests this psalm may have been composed during David's residence at the palace, making these words even more poignant and personal. Archaeological evidence shows that David had an actual stone refuge where he could literally hide in the shadow of God's wings. Here's what absolutely stuns researchers about the papyri's historical accuracy. Every geographical reference that can be verified through archaeological evidence proves correct. Every cultural detail that can be checked against other ancient sources, matches perfectly. Every chronological marker aligns with biblical and secular historical records. These aren't legendary accounts that developed over time through oral tradition. They're contemporary documents that recorded events as they happened, written by people who were actually there. You won't believe what the papyri reveal about David's spiritual development during his fugitive years. One fragment describes nighttime prayer vigils, where David would climb to the palace's highest tower and spend hours seeking God's guidance for the challenging decisions he faced daily. Another mentions how he continued composing psalms during this period, many of which would later be incorporated into Israel's worship traditions. The archaeological discovery of what appears to be a private chapel within the palace confirms these accounts. Consider this reality that should encourage every believer struggling with delayed promises or seemingly impossible circumstances. David spent approximately 7 years at the Shiloh palace, knowing God had anointed him as Israel's next king, but unable to claim his throne while Saul remained alive. The papyri describe his patience, his refusal to take matters into his own hands, his consistent trust that God's timing would prove perfect, even when human logic suggested otherwise. Think about how the palace discovery validates everything Scripture teaches about God's protective care for his people. David wasn't just lucky to survive Saul's pursuit, or clever enough to outwit royal soldiers through his own intelligence. God provided supernatural protection through human agents who risked their lives to aid his anointed king, through geographical advantages that favored defensive positions, through timing that consistently allowed David to stay one step ahead of his enemies. Imagine what it means that these discoveries are emerging precisely during 2025, a year that many biblical scholars believe marks the beginning of prophetic fulfillment that will prepare God's people for end times challenges. The timing isn't coincidental. Just as God preserved David's palace and the Shiloh Papyri through 3 millennia of historical upheaval, he has orchestrated their discovery for exactly this generation that needs encouragement to trust his protection during uncertain times. Here's the truth that transforms how we read David's entire story. His fugitive years weren't a detour from God's plan or a delay in his destiny. They were essential preparation that developed the character, wisdom, and leadership skills he would need as Israel's king. The Shiloh Papyri reveal that David understood this even while living through the difficulty, that he viewed his exile as divinely appointed training rather than unfortunate circumstance. You need to understand what the palace represents for contemporary believers facing their own seasons of waiting and uncertainty. Just as David's stronghold at Shiloh provided security during his most vulnerable years, God continues to provide refuge for everyone who trusts his promises, even when circumstances seem hopeless. The same divine protection that preserves Israel's future king operates in every believer's life, sometimes through miraculous intervention, sometimes through human agents, always according to perfect timing. Here's what should absolutely amaze you about the prophetic timing of these revelations. We're living during a period when biblical authority faces unprecedented challenges, when faith itself seems under attack from multiple directions, when even committed believers sometimes struggle with doubt about God's power and presence in contemporary circumstances. Into this environment, God has provided tangible evidence that His Word records historical truth, that His promises have always been backed by supernatural power, that archaeology continues to validate rather than challenge biblical accounts. The Shiloh Papyri contain one fragment that particularly speaks to our current generation. Written in David's own hand, according to paleographic analysis, it reads, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me in this house of refuge. Your rod and your staff comfort me, even when kings pursue and armies gather." These words would later become part of Psalm 23, but they originated during David's darkest hour at his palace stronghold. You won't believe what the archaeological team discovered in what appears to be David's private quarters within the palace. personal items including a bronze mirror, a seal for official correspondence, and what might be the actual harp on which he composed many of his psalms. The instrument shows signs of extensive use and bears Hebrew inscriptions that match the poetic style found throughout the Psalms attributed to David. Consider the incredible preservation story that brought both the palace and papyri to simultaneous discovery in our generation. The building materials came from local limestone quarries that provided natural protection against weathering. The papyrus fragments were preserved in sealed pottery containers that created perfect conditions for organic material survival. Divine providence orchestrated not just the construction and concealment, but the preservation and revelation according to his perfect timeline. Think about what it means for global Christianity that these discoveries strengthen faith at exactly the moment when believers worldwide face increasing persecution, cultural opposition, and intellectual challenges. Churches in restricted nations, where Christians risk their lives for gathering to worship, can draw courage from David's example of trusting God during periods of official hostility. Believers in secular societies, where faith faces intellectual ridicule, can point to archaeological evidence that validates biblical truth. Picture this reality that should transform your understanding of how God works in human history. Every stone in David's palace was placed according to divine architectural plans that extended far beyond immediate survival needs. Every word in the Shiloh Papyri was preserved according to prophetic purposes that reached across 3 millennia to encourage believers who wouldn't be born for thousands of years. God's plans operate on timescales that dwarf human comprehension, yet they include intimate concern for individual needs and circumstances. Here's what changes everything about how you should approach your own seasons of waiting, testing, and apparent delay. David's palace years weren't wasted time or unfortunate detours. They were intensive preparation for responsibilities that would affect not just his own life, but the trajectory of human civilization. The Psalms he wrote during this period continue to comfort believers worldwide. The administrative skills he developed became the foundation for Israel's golden age. The character qualities he strengthened through adversity enabled him to handle success without corruption. You need to grasp the extraordinary scope of what these discoveries reveal about God's faithfulness across generations. The same divine protection that preserved David through his fugitive years protected his palace through Assyrian invasions. The same providential care that orchestrated his rise to Israel's throne orchestrated the preservation of these papyri through centuries of conquest and destruction. The same perfect timing that brought him to power at exactly the right moment has brought these discoveries to light during our generation's moment greatest need for biblical encouragement. Consider this mind-blowing reality about the Hebrew inscriptions found throughout the palace complex. They include prayers, administrative records, personal correspondence, military communications, diplomatic documents, and portions of what would later become biblical psalms. Together they create the most comprehensive window into David's inner life and administrative methods ever discovered. The papyri aren't just historical curiosities, they're personal glimpses into the heart and mind of the man described as a man after God's own heart. Think about how these discoveries should affect your prayers, your expectations, your trust in God's timing for your own circumstances. David spent years in that palace believing God's promises, while living with their fulfillment still future. He administered an alternative kingdom, while the official king still occupied Jerusalem's throne. He prepared for responsibilities he couldn't yet openly claim. His example demonstrates that faith often requires acting on God's promises before their fulfillment becomes visible to others. Here's what should fill you with overwhelming confidence in God's sovereign control over human affairs. Every detail of David's preservation, preparation, and promotion demonstrates divine orchestration that extends across decades and affects generations. The same God who arranged for loyal priests to provide sanctuary, for skilled craftsmen to build a secret palace, for faithful followers to join a fugitive's cause, continues to orchestrate circumstances in contemporary believers' lives with identical precision and care. The Shiloh Papyri and David's Palace aren't just archaeological curiosities or interesting additions to the biblical knowledge. They're divine encouragement for this generation, physical proof that the same God who protected Israel's future king continues to work behind the scenes of human history, orchestrating events according to purposes that transcend earthly understanding, preparing his people for destinies greater than they can imagine. You won't believe what this means for your own faith journey. Every time you read about David's psalms of trust and protection, every time you encounter biblical promises about God's refuge and strength, you can now envision the actual stones where those truths were lived out in historical reality. Every time you face circumstances that seem hopeless or timing that appears wrong, you can remember that the same divine protection that sustained David at Shiloh operates in your life with identical power and precision. Consider this reality that should transform how you pray, how you trust, how you wait for God's timing in your own circumstances. David's palace has been waiting 3,000 years beneath the soil of Tel Shiloh to encourage exactly this generation that needs proof of God's faithfulness. The papyrus fragments have been preserved through conquests and destructions, through empires rising and falling, through every attempt to erase biblical truth from human memory. Also, you could hold physical evidence that God keeps his promises, no matter how impossible circumstances appear. Think about what it means that you're alive during this unprecedented period of biblical confirmation and archaeological validation. Generation after generation of believers trusted God's word based on faith alone, without the benefit of physical proof that's now emerging from sites throughout the Holy Land. You have been chosen to live during a time when faith meets fact, when spiritual truth receives historical validation, when archaeological discovery confirms scriptural accuracy with scientific precision. Here's what should fill you with overwhelming gratitude and unshakable confidence. The same divine faithfulness that preserved David through his fugitive years, that protected his palace through 3 millennia of upheaval, that orchestrated perfect timing for these discoveries to strengthen contemporary faith, operates in your personal circumstances with identical care and precision. The adventure that began when Samuel anointed a shepherd boy in Bethlehem, that continued through giant killing and palace intrigue, that found its refuge at the stronghold in Shiloh, culminated in a throne that would prepare the way for an eternal kingdom. That same adventure continues today through believers who trust God's timing, who seek his refuge during difficult seasons, who believe his promises even when earthly circumstances suggest otherwise. The evidence is carved in stone, written on papyrus, validated by science, confirmed by prophecy. The only question is whether you're ready to trust the same God who preserved David for his destiny, to fulfill his perfect plan for your life.